The wind rolled low across the plains that night, carrying with it the smell of dust, wood smoke, and something heavier blood waiting to be spilled. Malachi Brooks sat on the porch of his ranch house, hat pulled low, listening to the uneasy quiet that had fallen over his land. The cattle had gone still in their pens, their lowing cut short as if they, too, sensed what was coming. His hand rested close to the worn handle of his revolver, not from fear, but from instinct. A man who lived this far from town couldn't afford the luxury of doubt. It began with the sound of a single rider cutting through the silence. Hooves striking the hard-packed earth, slow and deliberate, like a drumbeat before execution. Malachi rose to his feet, every line of his body taut, and stepped into the yard. The moonlight broke enough to reveal the figure, tall, lean, a man who wore his violence openly. A rifle rested across his saddle, but it was the gleam of the long knife at his hip that drew Malachi's eye. Some men carried weapons for protection. This one carried them for pleasure. "Evening, rancher?" the stranger called, voice as rough as gravel dragged across steel. "Heard tell you been feeding mouths that ain't yours to feed." Malachi said nothing at first. He studied the man, the horse, the shadowed eyes that hid more than they revealed. Words could be as dangerous as bullets out here, and he had learned long ago that silence often kept him alive. The stranger spat into the dirt and nudged his horse closer. "Ain't right, you taking in strays. You give shelter, food, maybe even hope. But hope breeds trouble, makes folks forget their place." Malachi's jaw tightened. He thought of the mother and her child he had given bread to just 2 nights ago, ragged and starving, desperate enough to knock on a stranger's door. He had seen the hollow cheeks of the woman, the sunken eyes of her boy, and he would not turn them away. The memory of their gratitude still lingered, softening the hard edges of his solitude. But the man before him had no softness. His eyes were the eyes of a scavenger circling death. "This is my land," Malachi said at last, his voice steady. "I'll decide who eats at my table." The stranger's grin was slow, thin, and dangerous. "Then maybe it's time someone decided for you." In one fluid motion, the man swung down from his horse, boots hitting the ground with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. His hand hovered near the knife, and the air between them grew sharp, stretched to breaking. Malachi's fingers brushed the grip of his revolver, but he did not draw. Not yet. A gun was a final word, and he wanted the man to speak his intentions clear. "You drive folks away, rancher," the stranger said, pacing in a slow circle. "Or I drive you into the ground. Simple choice." The rooster's crow had barely broken the dawn when Jacob stirred awake. The faint orange glow of sunrise leaked through the cabin's shutters, casting long stripes across the wooden floor. For a moment, he thought he was alone, that perhaps the weary stranger had vanished into the night as quietly as he had come. But when Jacob pushed himself upright, he saw Elias sitting near the dying fire, wide awake, his posture still and watchful like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. "You sleep at all?" Jacob asked, rubbing the fatigue from his eyes. Elias didn't look at him. "Sleep invites dreams. I've had enough of those." There was something in the way he said it flat, almost bitter, that made Jacob decide not to pry. Instead, he brewed coffee, the sharp scent filling the cabin, grounding him in simple routine. But as he set a tin cup down in front of Elias, Jacob couldn't help but notice the stranger's hands. They weren't the hands of a drifter. Calloused, yes, but not the rough scars of a ranch hand or prospector. His grip spoke of weapons, not plows. His stance spoke of command, not labor. Whoever Elias was, he wasn't what he pretended to be. "You plan to ride out today?" Jacob asked after a stretch of silence. Elias lifted his eyes, pale as a winter sky. "You'd want that, wouldn't you? For me to vanish before the trouble catches up." Jacob studied him carefully. "I don't turn a man out who needs help, but I won't lie, I'd like to know what I'm up against if trouble's trailing behind you." Elias's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Fair enough. You want the truth? It won't sit easy." Jacob leaned back, his hand resting near his belt where his Colt hung. "Not a threat, just habit. Try me." Elias's voice dropped low, like confession and warning all at once. "I wasn't just walking that trail, Jacob. I was leaving behind men who would burn half this valley to the ground just to see me dead. And if they learn you gave me a ride, your land won't be yours much longer." The words settled in the cabin like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Jacob felt the air thicken, though outside the birds were still singing as if the world hadn't just shifted under his boots. "Who are they?" Jacob asked finally. Elias looked into the fire's dying embers, as though the flames replayed old sins. Men who called themselves partners. "Years back, I helped stake claims in the silver veins north of here. The mines weren't just rock and ore, they were worth fortunes, enough to build empires. But greed don't share well, Jacob. What began as partnership turned to blood, and the last man standing was expected to take all. Trouble is, I'm still standing, and they hate me for it." Jacob exhaled slowly, trying to piece it together. "So you walked away from a fortune?" "No." Elias's voice hardened. "I walked away from men who'd kill their own kin for a scrap of silver. Men like Charles Rourke." The name hit Jacob like a hammer. Even a cowboy who kept to himself had heard of Rourke, an empire builder who ruled half the Western Territory with iron fists and a ledger inked in blood. If Elias had crossed him, then Jacob hadn't just offered a ride to a weary traveler. He had thrown open his door to a storm bound to tear through everything in its path. As if on cue, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Jacob stiffened, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Elias was already on his feet, stepping toward the window with the smooth precision of a man used to expecting violence. They both watched as dust rose along the ridge, a dozen riders, maybe more, cutting across the land with ruthless intent. "They've found me," Elias said quietly. Jacob's gut clenched. His land wasn't rich, his cabin wasn't grand, but it was his. He'd carved it out with sweat and sacrifice, and now, because of one act of kindness, all of it was at risk. "Best thing you can do is ride hard and leave me here," Elias said, his tone steady, almost resigned. "Rourke wants me, not you." Jacob stared at him, anger flaring hot in his chest. "You think I'm the kind of man who throws a guest to the wolves? If trouble's coming, it'll meet both of us." For the first time, Elias's mask cracked. He studied Jacob with something close to respect, maybe even guilt. "Then you're a bigger fool than I thought." The riders drew closer, their shapes cutting clear against the morning light. Dust trailed them like banners of war. Jacob felt every instinct screaming at him to run, but something deeper held him still. He thought of the land outside the fields, the cattle, the sweat he'd poured into every fence post and plank. He thought of how men like Rourke believed the world belonged only to them, that everything and everyone was just coin waiting to be claimed. Not today. Jacob grabbed his rifle from the mantel, loading shells with quick, steady motions. Elias drew a revolver from beneath his coat. Jacob hadn't even seen it there before, and checked the chamber with practiced ease. "You any good with that?" Jacob asked, nodding to the weapon. Elias's eyes flickered with dark amusement. "Good enough to make devils hesitate." The riders came into view now, their faces hard, their movements sharp. At their center rode a man in a dark vest with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His presence radiated authority like heat off desert stone. Charles Rourke himself. When they pulled up a stone's throw from the cabin, Rourke lifted his hand, signaling his men to hold. His voice carried easily across the quiet morning. "Jacob Holloway, you've got something that belongs to me." Jacob stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his stance steady. Elias followed, his revolver glinting in the rising Sunday. "Don't reckon I do," Jacob answered, his voice calm, though his pulse hammered in his ears. Rourke smiled, cold and wolfish. "You've got Elias Ward under your roof, and that makes your roof mine." Elias's name rolled across the valley like a curse, and Jacob felt the weight of it settle heavy on his shoulders. Whatever this man had carried with him, it was no longer his alone. Jacob was part of it now, bound by choice and by circumstance. Rourke's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "Step aside, cowboy. I'll take him and leave you your land. Interfere, and by this time tomorrow, you won't own a blade of grass in this valley." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the restless shifting of horses. Jacob looked at Elias, then back at Rourke. His choice was clear, though every survival instinct screamed otherwise. "This land's mine," Jacob said, his voice low but unyielding. "And no man takes what's mine while I draw breath." The words hung in the morning air, a declaration, a defiance. Rourke's expression hardened, and with a flick of his hand, his men began to fan out, circling like wolves around prey. Elias shifted beside Jacob, his revolver steady, his gaze locked on the enemy. "You just signed a death warrant, Holloway," he murmured. Jacob's grip on the rifle tightened. "Then, let's make it worth the ink." And as the sun rose higher over the valley, the first shots cracked through the air, announcing a battle that would decide far more than either man yet understood. The gunfire came sudden and sharp, shattering the stillness of the valley like glass breaking under a hammer. Jacob's rifle kicked hard against his shoulder, the shot slamming one of Rourke's riders from his saddle. Elias moved with lethal precision, his revolver barking again and again, each bullet finding its mark as if the weapon were an extension of his will. The porch rattled under their boots as they fired, the wood splintering from return shots. Horses screamed, dust rose, and the air thickened with smoke and the metallic bite of blood. Jacob ducked low, chambering another round, while Elias barely moved his stance calm, his aim unerring. "Keep your head down," Elias said. His tone clipped, almost casual, as another rider fell. "Don't need reminding," Jacob grunted, returning fire. For all their numbers, Rourke's men hesitated. They had expected to corner a tired drifter and a rancher soft from tending cattle, not face a man who shot like death himself and another who refused to give up what was his. Rourke, however, did not hesitate. He rode forward, calm amid the chaos, his revolver drawn but unused, as though he trusted time and fear to do the work for him. His presence alone steadied his men, kept them from breaking under the fury of Elias's skill. When the dust cleared for a heartbeat, Rourke called out, his voice carrying through the smoke. "Elias, you can't run from me forever. You know how this ends." Elias stepped forward onto the porch, eyes locked on Rourke. "You're right," he said coldly. "It ends today." Jacob's pulse hammered. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was old blood, old betrayal, boiling to the surface. The next volley came harder, more desperate. Jacob's rifle grew hot in his hands, his breath ragged. He felt a bullet tear across his arm, fire blooming along the flesh, but he held steady. Elias stood like a man possessed, cutting down Rourke's best with each squeeze of the trigger. But then the inevitable happened. Click. Empty. Elias dropped behind the porch rail, reloading with practiced speed, but the riders saw their chance. 3 broke from the line, charging forward, guns blazing. Jacob barely had time to curse before they were nearly on them. And then the sound split the air shotgun thunder. Mrs. Crane stood in the doorway, her hair wild, her eyes fierce, the double barrel in her hands spitting smoke. One rider toppled, then another. The third reeled as Jacob's rifle found him square. The porch was littered with bodies now, dust settling over the dead like a shroud. But Rourke still sat his horse, untouched, his eyes burning with fury. "You think this is victory?" he snarled. "You've just invited ruin to your doorstep. Every man who rides for me will come, every coin in my vault will be spent to see you buried. Holloway, you'll be lucky to die quick. And Elias," his voice hardened, "you'll crawl back on your knees before I'm done." Elias stood, his revolver loaded once more, his gaze unblinking. "You always did mistake fear for loyalty, Charles, but men who follow coins scatter when the coin dries up." As if summoned, the sound of fresh riders rose from the east, dozens of them, thundering toward the valley. Jacob's heart sank reinforcements, but then he saw their banners, ragged but unmistakable, and Elias smiled for the first time since Jacob had met him. "These aren't Rourke's," Elias murmured. "They're mine." The riders swept in like a storm, surrounding Rourke's men, cutting them down with ruthless efficiency. What had once been Rourke's overwhelming force was now dwarfed, trapped, broken. His men began to falter, weapons dropping, eyes wide with betrayal. They hadn't known Elias still commanded loyalty, that his exile hadn't stripped him of everything. Rourke realized it too late. He turned his horse, spurring it hard, but Elias's voice cracked like a whip across the battlefield. "No more running, Charles." The shot rang out, and Rourke tumbled from his saddle, the dust swallowing him. He lay still, his empire bleeding into the dirt. The silence that followed was deafening. Smoke drifted. Horses stamped nervously. The valley seemed to exhale. Jacob lowered his rifle, his arm burning from the graze, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He looked at Elias, who stood over Rourke's fallen form, his revolver still in hand, his face carved from stone. "It's done," Jacob said quietly. Elias shook his head. "No, this was just one man. The valley's full of vultures who'll circle soon enough. But now..." He looked at Jacob, his eyes sharp as steel. "Now we own it before they can." Jacob frowned, not understanding. "We?" Elias holstered his gun, stepping closer. "You gave me a ride when I was nothing but dust and bones. You stood when every sane man would have walked away. I won't forget that. By law and by fear, half this valley's mine now, and I'm giving it to you." The words landed like thunder. Jacob stared at him, stunned. "What the hell would I do with half a valley?" "Protect it," Elias said simply. "Work it. Make it something no tyrant can take." His expression softened, just a fraction. "A man like you won't hoard it. You'll make it thrive. That's why I chose you." And just like that, Jacob understood. Elias wasn't just a drifter. He was a man who had carried empires on his back, who had seen greed rot everything it touched. And in Jacob, he saw something different, a stubborn, quiet defiance that couldn't be bought. The sun rose higher, spilling gold over the valley. Men gathered, loyal to Elias, but looking now to Jacob as well. Mrs. Crane stood in the doorway, shotgun still firm in her hands, her eyes glistening with something like pride. Jacob felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Land, power, responsibility, all of it born from one simple act of kindness on a dusty trail. He took a deep breath, squaring his stance. "Then we'll hold it. Together." Elias nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement, and for the first time, Jacob thought he saw peace flicker in the man's haunted eyes. The valley had a new master now, not by conquest, not by greed, but by the stubborn will of a cowboy who offered a ride to a weary stranger. And though Jacob Holloway hadn't sought it by the next day, the land, the power, and the legacy of half the valley was his. Kindness can be dangerous. It can cost a man everything or give him more than he ever dreamed. Jacob Holloway's choice to lift a stranger from the dust changed not only his life, but the fate of an entire valley. What about you? What would you risk for a stranger? What battles would you fight for something bigger than yourself? If this story struck a chord, share it with someone who believes in honor, loyalty, and the price of standing your ground. And remember, sometimes the smallest gesture can turn the tide of destiny.